There we go. So again, just a few rules, just so that everybody can hear our speakers. If you're not speaking, if you would mute yourselves, that would be appreciated. Also, if you have any questions, if you'll drop them into the chat section, then either Gitanjali, Theresa, or myself can pull those up and answer as we have time. I'd like to start out by introducing our amazing speakers and quorum members. Excuse me. Theresa Rynard, originally from Canada, has lived in 6 countries across 3 continents, and I don't know how many time zones that is, Theresa, and she recently returned to London. In her most recent role as Global Chief Operating Officer for CB Richard Ellis GWS Enterprise, she was directly responsible for operational excellence and oversaw a team of 5,000. A big believer in servant leadership, she's passionate about developing talent and high-performing teams. She's an experienced mentor and launched the CB Richard Ellis Singapore Women's Network Mentoring Program and the CBRE APAC DE&I Council. She's also the CEO and founder of TNTR Ltd, a small real estate company, and a founding partner of 4C Advisory, a boutique consulting firm. Gitanjali Sakhuja is based in Washington, D.C., is the Associate General Counsel for Americares. Gitanjali mentors regularly with Streetwise Partners and the Legal Mentors Network, and has done quite a bit of work with a nonprofit IC, which is working on mapping pollution in the oceans. Previously, Gitanjali worked for the UN Development Program in New York, Geneva, and Jakarta, and both UNICEF and Maersk in Copenhagen. And with that, I'm going to just say a big thank you and hand this off to Theresa to get us started. And at the end, Meg Sullivan, Quorum's CEO and founder, will be bringing up our calls to action. So thank you both, and let's get started.
Okay, well, Diane, thank you for such a lovely introduction. I'm excited, and I thought it would be good to just kick off with why. Why is leading globally with confidence so important? And I think, as with much of what we do in business, it comes down to if you can lead globally with confidence and you get it right, you really do get so many more people engaged. You get more ideas, you get people helping to make your results and what you're trying to do better, because they're giving all of their know-how as well. That true engagement and ideas that you get. So it really culminates in, you get better business results, right? And who doesn't want that? And I think that it also impacts people, right? So for me, when I look at it, it's about what are the business results, but at the end of the day, a business is only a group of people. Even if it's 65,000 people, it's still just a group of people. And if you can impact your teams and your peers by demonstrating what good leadership looks like, right, and helping them to develop others, helping them to make people more comfortable, to give their ideas, to get involved, to show you where the great things are, to show you where the landmines are and the risks, and to help drive things forward, then, it improves your brand, it improves their brand, it improves the talent, and helps everything get better. So I thought it would be fun to start with kind of a little story that demonstrates, for me, one of my big light bulb moments is when I realized, oh, wow, okay, so this is what global leadership really means. This is what diversity and inclusion really means. And this is how I need to develop. And, just that light bulb moment, it took the blinders off of me a little bit. So many years ago, I think 2000, I went to work in Hong Kong from the UK. And I was doing some consulting with China Light and Power, which is a great company, and a lot of really good engineers, mostly Chinese men, but a lot of really good engineers. And I was leading teams to do transformation projects, looking at different projects that we were doing that How could we do this better, more efficiently, more effectively, getting better results, etc. And I was loving it. I was the facilitator of these teams, and I was getting great people together, and we were looking at the problem, and then we were brainstorming ideas and how we could do things differently. And I would put forward some ideas that I had. I'd put forward examples of where I'd seen things done differently before. And I would keep encouraging people and saying, you know, challenge what I'm saying. Challenge if you don't think that this will work. Tell me if you think that there's a better way. What are your ideas? And it was just crickets, right? It was silence, and it was a lot of people nodding and saying yes, yes, yes. And so I kept thinking I was being such an amazing, globally sensitive leader, and that I was encouraging people. I don't know everything. You know lots. You know this business better than I do. I'm here as the facilitator. Give me ideas, challenge, tell me how we could do it differently. And I just kept getting nothing. Everybody just kept saying, yep, Theresa, that's right. That's right. We'll do what you said. Now, there was a little bit of around the edges, but primarily that's what was happening. And so I was like, okay, I guess we've got it all right. I then took a break for 3 months and took a break from work, and I went to Beijing, to Beijing's Language and Cultural University to learn Chinese. And I was there all day, every day for 3 months. And at one point, one of our younger teachers came in. I guess she'd have been about 30, so maybe 35, but probably about 30. And she came in and she was incredibly upset, very emotional. And she stood up at the front of the class. And basically what she was saying is, why do you people keep asking questions? Why do you put your hand up and you don't know the answer? Why? And she was getting very upset to the point where she ended up almost hysterical, and she was crying. And she's saying, it is not your job to ask questions, right? It is my job to teach you, and it is your job to listen and your job to learn. And when you don't know the answer, don't put your hand up, right? When I ask the answer, those who know the answer should put their hand up. I don't understand why you keep putting your hand up when you're wrong, right? And so I left at the end of the day pretty shocked. And I started to think, and I was like, wow. And that was my light bulb moment. I had been approaching this team of brilliant engineers who were in their 40s and 50s and saying to them, challenge me if you think I'm wrong, suggest ideas. And I was saying that after I had already put forward my ideas. I was the consultant. I was the senior person from that kind of authority point of view, because I was the consultant. And so if they had been raised in the culture of an education system that I had just experienced, they were never going to ask questions. Because what I learned by going to university in Beijing is that the whole culture that these people had been in for decades was all about doing what the more senior person says, right? And not getting any points. Like in a Western culture, we normally get points for trying, right? You put your hand up and you might have got it right, you might have got it wrong, but at least you tried. There are no points for trying in the Chinese education system. You get a point if you got the right answer. And if you got the wrong answer, then you shouldn't have put your hand up. So once I understood that what I needed to do in leading globally was to really understand the people that I was talking to and the people that I was working with, and start to look at things from their perspective and their culture. So very quickly, I started making sure that I asked people their opinions before putting my opinion on the table. And that way I would truly get their views rather than them just agreeing and feeling that their opinion, if it didn't agree, would have been disrespectful, right? And I started asking people for their ideas and to talk about and to discuss, rather than using words like challenge me if you think I'm wrong, because nobody is ever going to tell the senior leader that they think they're wrong, but they will discuss an idea, right? So That was just kind of, I thought it was a great way to start off to kind of really bring it home and bring it focused. That was my big aha moment as I started on a journey that's lasted for years and is continuing on leading globally, and how to make sure that we really are doing it in a way that is engaging and not closing people down, really. So with that, Gitanjali, I'm going to hand over to you and ask you why it's important, and what was your big light bulb moment, or one of
Thanks,
them?
Theresa. I'm just gonna echo your sentiment. I'm super excited to have this conversation with you, and always wonderful to see fellow quorum members join us. So we hope that you do interrupt. We hope that you do share your experiences as well too. We've, Theresa and I have had our light bulb moments, but we'd also love to know what some of your light bulb experiences and moments have been as well too. So I loved your example, Theresa, or your story rather. And for me, I think I would say one of my key light bulb moments happened for me very early in my career when I was working in the UN. I was tasked on a project to roll out a global policy, and this strategy was being designed at headquarters. I was leading it. I was fresh out of law school. And I had this idea that, this policy would apply in whole across all the regions that we operated in. And this particular organization operated with, I could call, a bit of a hybrid sense of decentralization, right? So all these country offices are operating sort of independently, but then there are global policies that are overarching across these country offices. So in leading this implementation, kind of early on, I started to get some pushback from the country offices, and I was feeling very frustrated because, for me, it just seemed very straightforward. Everybody just needed to follow the policy. And I was going to have this great, wonderful, wonderful policy that was going to explain the rationale for why. And I had also brought into this conversation reps from each of the country offices and regions to sort of inform this process as we're putting it together. And then during a visit that I had to one of our offices in Southeast Asia, a local manager had pulled me aside and said something that shifted my perspective. And he said, basically, we're not resisting your initiative. We're just trying to figure out how to make it work within our reality. And it kind of struck me that, yeah, of course, this strategy, while it would make sense on this global scale, the local nuances, the market conditions, the regulations, even the cultural approaches similar to Teresa's experience in Hong Kong and China, they needed to be factored in to be able to succeed. So that conversation was a turning point for me. It was really that sort of light bulb flash moment to start thinking about global policy and a strategy to make it fit for local needs, rather than me trying to enforce it in rigidity and in full form, right? So the flexibility that one gets, that is actually the result of empowering your local teams and ensuring that they feel seen, that they're valued, that their context is actually informed, and they know how to then implement this policy that I'm putting forward. So that taught me, I would say, what global leadership was truly about. And it's for me, that balance between consistency and adaptability and making room for local perspectives within the global goals.
I love that. I mean, I hope that that colleague who took you aside and gave you that message is somebody that was able to stay with you for a long time, because I've always found it so valuable to have those one or two people who will tell you what you need to hear.
Absolutely. 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 So I've got some questions for you, Theresa. Maybe starting with the first. How have your global roles helped you to become a better leader? I know you mentioned 6 countries, 3 continents, but how have all of those informed your leadership style?
Well, I think the first thing is, hopefully we've all got really good self-awareness, and that comes over time. And we're all a product of how we were raised and what we did. And I was raised by a mother whom one of her favorite phrases was, my way or the highway, right? You do it my way or you're out. And she really meant it. And so for me, I guess one of the first learnings as a leader was to learn that different didn't mean wrong. It's just different. And that there are many ways to get to an objective. You need to be clear about the objective, but the routes there can be many. And as a matter of fact, after I learned that different didn't mean wrong, I then later learned that actually different can be even better than the original result or objective that you were expecting, because all of those different perspectives, if you can bring them out and you can listen to them and take them into account and be willing to flex your ideas, still keeping your eye on where you need to get to, but maybe adjusting the journey on how you're going to get there, then you can actually get an even better result in the end. Those contributions, the ideas, and all that discretionary effort that you get when people are really bought in, for me, gets the best results. So it's made me a better leader because it's taught me that different doesn't mean wrong. It's made me listen, truly listen, and then be able to incorporate that so that we can get better results. And I think that the other thing that I'd say is it's made me much better at spotting talent and understanding how to develop that talent. I think that, if you look at talent just through the eyes of what you're used to, then for me, I'm a very direct person. Canadians are very nice, but they're also very direct, right? And so I would always spot talent that was also direct because it was something that I would attune to. But what I learned was to spot talent that maybe was from an introvert, or maybe talent from people who were less direct and more questioning rather than telling. And then I was able to respond by supporting them in a way that worked for them. What about you?
I would agree. I think what I would add is perhaps, what you were mentioning about different not being wrong, but using different as the lever, right? The lever to different paths to problem solving. I think the skills that have come about from my time working in different geographies has been really to cultivate empathy and patience. And part of that is also the patience with myself to not, sort of jump the gun and be perceived in norms that don't quite land as, or translate well when you cross continents or countries. But that empathy, that patience to be able to look for then this talent, to look for different answers, to amplify voices, to test and try different approaches, to find those needs of your stakeholders, to find that common ground for objectives. I think those are the skills that I have applied, I think, the most and sort of strengthened along my journey. And I think that's what ends up making me more flexible and more strategic.
Right. So I'm glad you landed on strategic, because one of the questions I wanted to talk about is around strategy, right? So being a leader, no matter what kind of leader you are, strategy and then making that strategy work is all part of being a leader. So let's talk for a minute about creating strategy and navigating the major pivots that you have when you're a global leader. What's different about doing this in a global role compared to maybe a national or a local role?
Yeah, I love that question. So I think for me, in a global role in particular, strategy has to be more nuanced. Yeah, because you're not necessarily thinking about one market, but you're thinking about a blend of multiple markets. Each, when I speak from a legal compliance orientation, so you're dealing with different laws and regulations in each of the jurisdictions. You're dealing with a very varied and a diverse customer base. You're dealing with a very sort of blended also workforce, but then again, all these business cultures. So in your strategy, it cannot be this one size fits all, which for me was that light bulb moment that I alluded to earlier, right? Trying to think that I can just stretch something across and it works everywhere. So I think while from like a headquarters perspective, you're driving these broader objectives, but being able to sort of navigate those pivots, those complexities, and those challenges to make sure that whatever your strategy you're trying to impart will be deeply entrenched and embedded requires then that deeper understanding of what's important in that particular locality and how does that then align with those broader goals. So I think it's very much about balancing that consistency with that local adaptability, but then also tailored to the local dynamics that are at play. So again, your legal frameworks, the geopolitical, the risks, those markets, those cultures that influence those very different types of decision-making styles that might also be at play. I think all of that adds that layer of complexity. But again, making sure that everyone's on that page specific to that particular locality. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about
And has
you?
that got easier for you or more difficult or just always this, like it's still as hard as it was in the beginning?
No, I think, well, I mean, I think as I was alluding to, there's no strategy that's a one size fits all. And same in your playbook, you also don't have like one go-to page of skills that you can tap into, but you've got your toolbox. And in that toolbox, whether you're using the wrench one day or the hammer the next day, you've at least got, the skills and resources that you might need and what you might need to augment to that specific locality that you're dealing with. So I think it's made me stronger and quicker to kind of go in and assess the lay of the land, but to have better questions to ask, right? And to make sure that I'm inviting the varied sense of people that need to have a seat around the table.
Yeah. No, I like that. I think that you're right. I think you get quicker and you get richer on the questions and you start to understand how to ask the question in a way that'll bring more out. And how to sometimes triangulate to make sure that your understanding of what you think you're hearing is right. I guess for me, I tend to think about almost the visual of a core with a little fluffy edge around it, right? So, be really clear when you're doing your strategy of what you're trying to achieve. That doesn't move. So for me, it's the what and the how, right? I think of, okay, so what's the core that needs to be consistent, right? There's some absolute things that we must do. And you mentioned regulatory environments and what have you. Some of those will be absolutely consistent, and others you might decide you're going to bring it to the highest bar just for consistency, or you might decide you're going to flex it. And then how do we flex around there for how we do this in a way that suits everyone? I kind of ask myself, almost two key questions as I go through those conversations and those thought processes that you described really well. One is, what's the core versus what's the flex? So what has to be consistent, and how do we make that as consistent as possible? Because when you first start to talk to people, they'll all say that they're different, right? And that's not just an international or a global thing. You get that in the UK with different cities and parts of the UK saying, oh, we're different in the north, right? You get it in the US with people in New York saying, no, we're different in New York, right? So You know, you get the what can we make as a consistent core, and then what needs to flex. And as I go through that, I ask the question about need versus want, right? Which is, does it really need to, or do you just want it to? And want doesn't mean no, we won't do it just because you want it. Sometimes we don't need to, but we want to because it'll resonate so much better. And it'll bring out such a better response, or it really will be a wow factor with our client base. So I go through like the core and the flex, as you said, and then what's the need in there versus what's the want. And that to me helps to flesh out, you know, what do people just want because we've always done it that way, versus what do they want or need because it really will make a difference, and a difference that you want to bring on board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. So moving into communications, I know we've touched a little bit around different styles that are at play, but what in your experience do communications sort of take shape in this in the spectrum of various team settings? So going from local to global.
Yeah. So I think the first thing is to remember that you need to be understood, right? And it sounds pretty obvious, but in a global setting, then if you start with I need to be understood, then you can make lots of adjustments, because you need to remember that not everybody who's listening or who's participating in the discussion is going to have the language you're speaking in as their first language. So how do you make communications simple, to the point, straightforward, right? If I'm giving things like town halls, I try and use slides that are really visual, so that if people don't understand every word, they still get the message because of the visuals that are on the page. And I used to, when I started, I used to think about slow down. I had like sticky notes on my laptop screen and things that said slow down, and that didn't work. But when I changed it to you want to be understood, then I naturally just changed my pace. And I do this so automatically now. One of my very best friends, and she's been a really dear friend for like 37 years or something. She's Polish. She lives here in London, but she's Polish. And I was at her place for dinner last weekend, and she had a friend from Poland over, and her friend from Poland speaks very little English. And then I met up with Gosha the other day for a coffee, and she said, you know, Anita found it very hard at the party with everybody, but she said it was a little easier with you, and I wanted to thank you. And it was only because I didn't talk like this, which I would talk to if I was talking to lots of English people. I talked the way I'm talking here because I'm talking to an audience and I want to be understood. And I didn't even think about it, but I naturally just slowed my pace, articulated more clearly, used simpler, more straightforward words, and didn't use lots of euphemisms or colloquialisms and what have you, right? And I think that, you know, I really noticed that. I've worked for companies like CBRE and American Express, and I noticed that on lots of American calls, people use lots of sports analogies. And so what I've started to do actually to be inclusive is, rather than use no sports analogies or no, I've tried to pepper and do my conversations. If it's a global call or a global communication, I kind of spice it up with some examples that I know will resonate with the Indian audience, and some examples or phrases that I know will resonate with my Chinese audience. And then, of course, I'll use a sports analogy, but I'm Canadian, so it's probably a hockey one rather than baseball, right? And so I think that you can avoid doing things that are too much of your culture, but you could also just do less and then do a little bit of other people's as well. And I found that actually makes people feel really included, right? So for me, that's kind of a really big difference in communication is that being understood, how you deliver the message, and do use some visuals, because I find it really helps, and I've had some good feedback on that. And then, figure out some things to do that actually make maybe those who are less prominent in the audience feel more included. And the final thing I would add is I try and find people, use the word audience in its virtual sense, but try and find to people to present rather than just me. So maybe I'll open, and I wouldn't even get, like, the finances for the quarter don't have to come from the CFO. Maybe they came from the CFO at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, but maybe throughout we get like a couple of the junior CFOs to present and give them a bit of limelight. And, we pull somebody from the engineering team and get them to talk about what they're doing. And I find, again, that just makes people really engaged and really inclusive, and it doesn't feel like, oh, here we go again, the leaders are just talking at me.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, I think I can very much relate to what you described as your communication style of speaking slower and in simpler terms. I think my way of speaking completely transformed the first time that I went abroad. That, in my, I guess, American English, of a very fast-paced way of talking, and a lot of slang or colloquialisms that are kind of tossed around. You could just see the other person's reaction, and they'd just be like a deer in headlights, going like, "Whoa, why do you have potatoes in your mouth? Stop, like, can you slow down a little bit?" And it's become a bit funny in a way, because um I've adapted a sort of very different accents that people
Yeah.
can't figure out where I'm from, because I speak in simpler terms, or I break things down so that the message can be understood and be digested by the different audience, the composition of the audience that I'm speaking to. So, from my time with Maersk, for example, my stakeholders were everyone from folks at the board level to, crew aboard vessels. Very diverse range across, 30, 40 countries. And really needing to make sure how I am articulating and expressing myself and putting across my message. What I did, and what I found to be very useful was, as you mentioned, making sure that you have this understanding. For me, it was having regular check-ins, like taking someone from crew, for example, on a policy that's going to impact them aboard the vessels, and ask for their contributions. Like, how do we put this in terms and terminology that is understood, what it is that we're trying to implement? Because otherwise, then it's just a policy that I'm, again, putting out, and have no way for it to be actually embedded into business practice, right? I found utilizing a lot of different cross-functional teams and my stakeholders to be then that point and that source for pushing out what it is that I'm trying to implement, coming from the legal side of things. So if it is, for example, how we are looking at high risk vendors, that I'm working very closely with the procurement and sourcing and logistics teams, and having them be the ones that are at the forefront of putting out the information to the organization, because that's, for me, the best way that I've found to have that relate across, because they understand they understand the subject deeply, and why not leverage that capacity that sits within that subject matter. So I think that has been where I found the sources of success. I think very much, again, around, trying to be clear, being patient, being very flexible. One thing that I'm also experiencing now that I've kind of come back to the US is yet again another cultural transformation in how I'm speaking. So the tempo and the pace is accelerated somewhat. But I see now, and I observe as my colleagues talk a little bit about orienting themselves to, this is my communication style. So if someone you're meeting for the first time is sharing with you, hey, I prefer to work on the side of being direct, or someone else will explain, this is how I operate. I've found that to be very insightful, that I'm getting cues of information direct from my stakeholders who are saying, this is how I best receive information. So it gives me that insight of how to then present myself to stakeholders.
Yeah, I really like what you said when you talked about, when you were at Maersk, and, part of the audience is also the people who work on the ships, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's easy to think about all of the communication styles and how you need to adjust from country to country to country. But we also need to remember you need to adjust from the boardroom down
Mm-hmm.
to the engineers or the people out on the retail floor, or the people, out in sales or what have you. There's also those adjustments that we need to make. And I love how you kind of, brought that in as well. I've also found that when I first started this, and it's always good to have somebody who will kind of give you cues, like that person who took you aside and said, we're not against the policy, we just need to make it work in our reality. I used to have in Singapore, I had an assistant CFO who took it upon herself, she said, to help me be successful, which I thought was brilliant. And so she used to just sit there as I was doing a conversation, whether it was video or a small group or whatever, and she would either nod positively if I was hitting home with the audience, or she would just sit there and go, right? And so it was very subtle. Nobody knew that she was doing it. And I'm not even sure in the beginning she did, but I had a conversation with her after. I'm like, please keep doing that. And actually tell me afterwards of each one, like, what did I do well and what did I not do well? And so here I was like 50 years old and she was like 23. And I was saying, help me make sure that I'm getting it right with the different audiences. And she was brilliant.
That's wonderful. I think that's always helpful to have an ally who
Yeah,
can provide you with that bit of support, right? So
yeah,
that's wonderful.
yeah. And help that self-awareness as you kind of move around.
Absolutely.
I think one of the other questions I'd love to explore is, how have you dealt with in this great career in working in different places in different roles? How have you dealt with the challenges of being a woman and being a woman from the different cultures and different background that you're from while you're working globally? What does that mean to the issues that you encounter, and how do you deal with them?
Uh-huh. Um, I think that's a great question. And being a woman, sort of traveling from different place to place, you're always different. Yeah. So I think it's really been an ongoing and a learning experience. And I think first and foremost, I mean, being a female leader for me has meant navigating a lot of biases, a lot of assumptions about what leadership is supposed to look like. So I've got a little bit this double whammy that wherever I've landed, I've been a woman and I've been a person of color. Um, and kind of what comes part and parcel of being both, and then using your voice is sometimes, and you're very easily mistaken as being arrogant. And I've kind of found that, rather than having to fight that at every place that I've lived and landed, I've rather had to adapt to it. And so, because of that, diplomacy and I would say self-belief, like knowing my inherent worth, have been lifelong practices. Accepting really that like the biases around me aren't going to change, and I'm not going to go to every place and start fighting against the world. Um I think that's been an important growth edge for me. And I think that, many people, we all in this room right now know that, we're often as women sensitized to need to take on that sort of softer approach. But for me, it's been rather, I've been prepared to sort of calmly challenge these comments and behaviors, and I didn't know what to sort of call it out at the time. But a mantra for me has really been, one that, like, I don't have to see it to be it. And I had to do that because if I didn't, my imposter syndrome would take over, and then that would be the end of me being able to excel. So, the challenge wasn't not seeing myself somewhere else, because I was always going to be that different. That was always going to be the common denominator for me. And by sort of not looking for, I need to see someone who looks like me in roles of leadership, was to kind of push myself that if I didn't, I would start to question myself, who I was, what I was, and then I'd start to edit myself, and then I'd start, like, once you start chipping away at the block, then your voice becomes smaller and smaller, and you end up muting your voice. So I think for me, I had to learn it painfully early on, that it's unfair, but knowing that my confidence, my voice could be taken wrong, I've had to, assert myself with a fashion confidence of respecting cultural norms, which is a bit of a delicate dance that you have to do. Yeah. Um, One of the things that you and I have talked a little bit about, Theresa, in terms of, like, asking different questions, making sure that what we are trying to convey is understood. So one of the ways that I found success in my work when I come to a table is to approach brainstorms by asking questions rather than telling, right? So a little to your light bulb moment. And I think sort of being a woman in that's different in every place is, I've had to build trust by leading with integrity. And what I mean by that is aligned with my uniqueness, right? And my different lived experiences. And that's where I think I found where my true value is, because I know how to work in complexity. I know how to develop and manage diversity. I know how to navigate not being seen or heard within structures. And that's the example that I want to continue being for other women, and to encourage them really to be themselves, and let them know that, I felt vulnerable through my career, and feeling vulnerable is perfectly okay. Yeah.
That's a great message. Yeah. I think for me, it was interesting to learn early on that differences and biases are not always so obvious. So, when I moved to Hong Kong and started working a lot in China and Japan and India, I knew I was going to have to prepare myself for things being different. It was obvious. But when I moved to the UK from Canada, I didn't have that expectation, and I didn't prepare for them. So I left Canada, I moved to the UK. Canada was founded, obviously from our Indigenous people, but then very much by the British and the French. Right. And so I have about this tiny much of Iroquois in me, a number of generations back, but I am really predominantly descended from British and French, almost 50-50. But I grew up in the English-speaking part of Canada in Ontario. And so, and I was raised, Catholic and Christian. So I thought, this is going to be fine. I'm going to the UK. It's Christian and it's Caucasian and it's of British heritage as I am. And so this is all going to be fine. And it was like running smack into a brick wall, because I just wasn't prepared. I thought I was going to be fit in, but what I encountered actually was quite a lot of prejudice. It didn't help by where I was working, which is I was working at the University of London in their central administration. And that was a lot of much older academics, mostly men, particularly at the time, as well as a lot of ex-Foreign Office people and a lot of expats. So a lot of the British civil service who had worked abroad, when they came back to the UK, they were given jobs in the university and other administrations. So I was referred to as from the colonies, right? And kind of, you know, somebody literally asked me one time, and I swear they weren't joking, whether we had electricity in our house. And I'm like, no, we live in a log cabin and we just have firelight. So, you know, and I started like hamming it up, right? I was like, well,
Yeah.
you know, one day I was upset and somebody asked me what was wrong. And I said, oh, well, my lead sled dogs just died. And I don't know when I get, you know, how my sister's going to get to school, right? Which of course is complete nonsense. But I kind of had to do that as a way of coping. But what I recognized from that was actually that the biases that we encounter and the prejudices aren't always that obvious. And so we need to be much more aware for ourselves as well as more sensitive to others, where it might not be so obvious. You know, I went for a promotion at the university and I was actually told that no young female foreigner was ever going to get any further than I had, and I should just be grateful for what I had.
Wow.
I later became his boss and fired him. But you know, so you know, that was a big learning for me. Overall, you know, I think there's always that bit of, as a woman who is forthright, and who's direct and who knows what they want, you kind of get accused of being maybe disrespectful and arrogant. And I think, you know, my advice is like, be confident. Confidence is not arrogance, right? And if you ever get that accusation, just quickly ask yourself, you know, are you being abrasive? Are you being pushy? Or are you just asking for what you want? Are you doing it with respect? Are you listening to others, or are you just kind of walking over them and ignoring them? Are you disrespecting people? And if all the answers to those questions are the right ones, then keep doing what you're doing, right? Keep being yourself. You know, feedback is a gift. And so if you get the feedback that you're being arrogant or pushy or what have you, question it. But you don't always they're not always right. So I think you pause, you assess, and then you're like, yep, I'm going to take that and make adjustments, or no, you're just wrong and I'm going to keep going. So I think, you know, have the confidence to do that, and understand also your own tolerances and your own perceptions. You know, I am very direct. It's a key part of me and me being authentic. I'm not going to hide that and all of a sudden sit in the background, because that would just not fit. It'd be like wearing somebody else's clothes. But I have learned over the years to temper it, right? To be more effective, right? So I kept the best part of that, which means that I am comfortable making decisions. I give people clarity, and I get a lot of feedback that people like that clarity. It's really clear what I expect from them, whether we're on track, whether we're not, etc. But I've tempered the part that can be intimidating, right? By asking questions from others, and by making sure that I am not the first to speak in the room. So that's probably one of the biggest things that I learned was, you know, ask everybody else their opinion and then state what yours is. Don't put yours out first, because then you actually close down so much richness and so many opportunities. And sometimes, if the opinion you were going to give has already been given 3 or 4 times around the table or in the room, then just shut up and don't say anything, right? You don't actually always need to talk as the leader. So yeah, those were just some pieces for me. And then smile. So, you know, again, when people are accusing you of being too harsh, but you're just being direct or whatever, if you're warm when you do it, that how, so the what doesn't change, but the how, if you can do it in a warm way with a smile, it just goes over so much better in every culture at every level of an organization. It just makes you so much more human.
True, I would say it definitely does make you more human. I think one of the pieces of feedback I've received from a number of male colleagues abroad is to smile more. And that to me is sometimes a bit antiquated and a bit what should what exactly should I be smiling about? What kind of feedback is that? Right? Like tell me something more about competence that I can improve upon in lieu of being told to smile more. But I think you're right. I mean, our our competencies sort of evolve over time, right? Our tolerances, our perceptions, our skills. And I think very much to what you were talking about earlier, that where you need to know from the feedback that you're given of what do you need to temper. And I think it's good to sort of lean into your strengths and then be mindful of the areas that perhaps you're not excelling in, because it's better that you know your blind spots rather than others know them on your
Yeah.
behalf. And then you don't get that insight to know what you need to be, what you need to potentially be managing.
Yeah.
I think perhaps, Theresa, just in the interest of time, because there's so much
Yep.
we can keep talking about, maybe we take one question and then we open up to others to share their experiences as well too.
You've read my mind. Let's do that.
Yeah, so we touched a little bit on diversity through our different sort of lived experiences, but how do you sort of enable diversity, and how do you really sort of truly create inclusion? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, I think diversity is relatively easy, right? Which is it's there when
Mhm.
you're in a global team. For me, it's then about making sure that it's there at every level, right? It's easy to say that we have all this diversity, but are we making sure that the leaders are diverse? Are we making sure that those key roles and key projects actually are diverse? Which to me is often where the gap is. So I think that, diversity, so long as you have awareness and intent, then it's relatively easy to do, but it does need to be done with intent. I think that inclusion is a little different and requires a little more effort, to create that culture, to get everybody's opinions open. And we've talked throughout this conversation of some different ways to get that inclusion and get people's opinions going, to listen. But I think I've spent a lot of time working between different peoples to help the inclusion. So if we think about kind of head office, headquarters, as well as the overall teams, particularly when we're talking about people and developing people in their careers and helping people get that next step up. As an example, I had somebody who was from New York headquarters who had an opening, and I knew somebody who was Malaysian who would be perfect for that. So I was able to set them up, and they talked, and it was a really good conversation on the subject matter. But the person from New York said, "Oh, I don't think that they really want it, because they weren't really driving at it, and they weren't hitting me hard with questions and what have you." And I had to say, but because you're senior and they were showing you respect, and there's no way they would do that. You said you loved the answers, but the style was different. And then I worked with, the Malaysian person, and said, look, when you're dealing with New Yorkers, you need to adjust a little bit. So allowing both of them to be themselves and authentic, but also trying to bridge where they needed to meet each other partway. They ended up that the person did get the job and has been super successful. But I think that's where, to me, other than the bits we've talked about over this hour for inclusion, that's another place where we can really drive inclusion, is by helping bridge that gap. What about yourself?
I would add to that. I mean, intention for diversity is a must. I think with intention to sort of build on that is trust needs to be there. Trust, I think for me very much sort of increases inclusion, increases that sharing of information, that openness, that fluidity, that cooperation. But beyond part of that, like intent and trust equation also needs to be that support that is there to actually drive any of these measures. It's not just about a metric to tick a box and say, okay, I went around the room and I asked everybody questions, so everybody's now included, right? But there are the mechanisms to within your leadership and within your workforce that are actually sort of effectuating this change that you are desiring to bring about, and to truly sort of bring about not only these like changes in your attitudes and beliefs, but also outward behavior, right? So I think that comes on the back of very much sort of having those support mechanisms that are built so that they can thrive and they can be sustainable, and you don't just have a diverse hire come in without a means to support their journey throughout. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we're pretty much out of time.
Yes,
This has gone by fast.
absolutely.
What a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Hopefully everybody else has, but thank you, Gitanjali. Thanks for the questions and the answers, and love it.
Theresa and Gitanjali, thank you so much for the conversation, because it was just packed. I have 4 pages of like little notes, which I'm gonna try and pare down and then share back with everybody, of what resonated for me, in terms of all the things that you spoke about. What's so fascinating is, as a leader, I feel like it doesn't matter if you're leading across markets or cultures or the globe, because even in today's world, if you're leading in a local environment, your teams are diverse inevitably by the mere fact of kind of how we're made up as an environment. So that challenge of all the things that you talked about, all the things you mentioned, actually apply in all situations of leadership, which I think is just amazing. So there were just some fantastic reminders. Just high level, I loved the notion of different can actually be better. That's such a great motto to remember. I also loved, Gitanjali, you talked a bit about having the confidence to be yourself and be different and authentic. And I think that's a struggle all of us leaders have on a regular basis, of just, never losing sight of ourselves and what we bring to the table. And it made me think about my own experiences in these situations, and the notion of your difference actually is truly valuable. So that's the interesting component too. Your own differences actually brings a whole load of valuable things to the table. And believe it or not, my most favorite thing was the notion about smiling, because funny enough, it's the one thing we always train folks on when they're publicly speaking, because you cannot engage your audience if they don't feel like they want to know you. And oddly, smiling, immediately engages the whole room in terms of wanting to connect with you, versus sort of over serious. So it's so funny. Like, they were such great nuggets in there. There were so many more. So I only talked about like 3, I think. It was ridiculous. There's so many in there. So I want to thank you for sharing all of that. And I'll share out my notes, and if you two want to add in. And I wanted to say, if folks had questions we didn't get to, I'm hoping maybe Theresa or Gitanjali, would you mind answering them, offline, since we've run out of time here today, if people wanted to engage with you in terms of their own struggles or things that they're running up against. I sort of thought I would put that out there. And it's the last sort of call to action. I'm going to put together these notes that I had. I feel like it's what's so important. And the last thing you guys touched on was how intentional we are about everything that we do. It makes us so much better as leaders for sure. And so I'd love for us to leave today thinking about intentionally how we can be more open and available to difference, and to ensuring that we create an inclusive environment in everything that we do, because that's, you have to actually, great leaders are the ones that lead by example. So one of the ways to get that back is to actually do it yourself, so I would sort of challenge us on that front to really think about that in the next day, year, month, ahead. And the only quick thing I'm going to mention, because I'm sorry we're running over time and I want to be respectful, is that the next big event for Quorum is our forum in New York City on the night of the 14th and the day of the 15th. And we have an incredible program planned. So I hope you're able to join us if you could. And we look forward to seeing many fabulous faces there so we can exchange more on a lot of these big issues. And a big round of applause to Gitanjali and Theresa one more time. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your experiences and being so candid with us. It was such a great conversation. So we really are appreciative. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for the ability to talk to you guys. I loved it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, listen, everybody, have an amazing rest of your week. So great to see all of you, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.